Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. This is the next webinar in the Productivity and Profitability series that's being brought to you by Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista. This is designed to assist beef, cattle and goat producers to increase the productivity and profitability of their businesses. This series will focus on providing technical, timely information that's relevant to you across Australia. My name is Tanisha Fields and I am a consultant with Agrista and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. In this webinar, we will be hearing from Dr. Gillian Kelly from Animal Health and Nutrition Consulting about containment feeding of livestock. And I will be discussing containment from feeding systems right through to conducting a feed budget. Before I hand over to tonight's speaker, I'll just cover off on some housekeeping. So tonight's webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of this webinar in the next couple of days, and it will also be available on the Agrista and MLA websites. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to ask questions of Jill as we're going through. We'll address all questions that come through at the end of the webinar. To ask your question, we're actually using Slido. So if you would like to ask a question, head to slido.com and enter the code NOV2023. I will hand over to tonight's speaker, Dr. Jill Kelly. Dr. Gillian Kelly is the founder of Animal Health and Nutrition Consulting, a company that she started in 2022 after almost 20 years as a production vet in the private and government sectors. Jill has a veterinarian degree with first-class honours from the University of Sydney and is a member of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists in the Ruminant Nutrition chapter. Jill grew up at Coonamble and loves working alongside producers, elbows deep sheep and cattle livestock health and nutrition issues throughout central and western New South Wales as well as Queensland. Jill is passionate proactive livestock production initiatives. The aim is to offset issues before they even occur. He founded the Drought Smoko concept, a way to provide education and support producers during drought, and was the inaugural host of the podcast Seeds for Success. Alongside all of that, Jill also runs a sideline cattle trading business, loves watercolour painting and camp drafting, and cooks a great batch of scones. Thanks, Jill. I'll hand over to you now to take over for tonight's webinar.
Beauty. Thanks, Tanisha. I'll just share my screen. How are we going? Can you see my screen?
Got your screen and the PowerPoint's there now as well.
Yep, great. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And thanks to Tanisha and Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista, as well as all the people that have given up an hour to be with us here tonight. I'm really pleased to be part of it. I'm coming to you tonight from Coonamble, where today we've had a much needed 20 mils of rain. So that was a nice surprise, and hopefully that's a sign of more to come. First of all, I just want to introduce you to tonight's topic. Containment feeding, you'll probably also hear it called confinement feeding, and these terms I'm going to use pretty interchangeably throughout tonight. This definition actually comes from MLA in that containment feeding is a drought feeding practice that aims to promote animal health and welfare while preserving ground cover and land condition across the majority of the property. So we're really not talking about feedlotting year-round for commercial gain. We really are talking about confinement feeding stock into smaller areas, either small paddocks or pens, for management during drought. It sometimes might be referred to as sacrifice paddocks, drought lots, or stock containment areas as well. And I really became involved in confinement feeding of livestock in a fairly significant way throughout our last drought. So we fed in paddocks throughout 2017 across the district. By early 2018, we'd gotten rid of the ground cover was essentially gone or significantly depleted, and many producers were opting to lock stock up. Actually, they did that in just yards and really basic setups and just slowly got a bit more, I suppose they built better setups as they went. And we fed animals in confinement from 2018 right up until March 2020 when the drought broke. So we really did learn a lot about how to manage livestock in confinement for long periods of time. And I think clients around this area really should be proud that they've now got somewhere to lock stock up when they need to, and they've got the confidence to use that as part of their management. So why would you make the decision to containment feed? Well, number one, it reduces your grazing pressure. So most environments, most grazing systems will have a pasture growth rate for the year, and that's how we sort of set up when we're going to lamb or when we're going to calve, so that the pasture growth meets the nutritional requirements of the animals. But increasingly so, as we move into a more variable climate, the weather doesn't read the textbook, and so we often get years where the feed curve doesn't pan out. Now that's tricky to manage. So one way of doing that is to use confinement to reduce stocking rate during those periods where it doesn't quite go to plan. We can use containment feeding to conserve topsoil and ground cover and to leave our paddocks rain ready so that when it does rain, we get growth and significant growth that's usable. We can lock stock up and reduce their feed requirements because they're not moving around. So we can actually save ourselves some money on feed. We can reduce labour inputs when they're all boxed together fairly close to the silos or the yards or the house. We can feed them in a relatively short space of time. We can production feed to meet targets if we needed to for a particular reason. We could early wean, and that's certainly something that clients around this area are doing this year in a fairly significant way. And this not only allows us to meet the nutritional needs of those high needs little animals, but it allows us to spare our breeders and reduce our feed costs. We can join pretty successfully in containment. We can maintain good welfare and health of the stock. And these areas it's not just drought. We could use them in fire, flood, and God forbid if we ever had a disease outbreak where we had to hold stock. They'd be also useful for that. And we get really good at nutrition when we've got animals confined, so we can really accurately control the dollars that are being fed out, and we can reduce wastage. So making the decision to lock stock up can be tricky. When you're looking at your pastures every day, you might not notice the decline. But I just want to briefly introduce you to SIBO Labs. So SIBO Labs is technology available for free to all My MLA members. And if you haven't linked SIBO Labs to your My MLA account, that's a job to do after tonight's webinar, I reckon. So you can log in and you can look at satellite images of your total standing dry matter on your farm. So this is a paddock at Coonamble in January this year. It sort of stopped raining for us in December 2022. So January we had quite a big bulk of feed, and then slowly that feed quality and quantity has declined. So you can see there January 2023, then February, then March, and then on the right there's October. The cattle were sold off that paddock in February 2023. And it's color coded. So the dark purple is 4,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare. The darker green is say 2,000. And once we start to get into those beige and red areas, it's getting down, below 1,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare. So you can use that technology to monitor the feed in your paddock and use that to help you make decisions about whether to move the stock, either for sale or for adjustment, or to lock them up in confinement. I just wanted to mention that before we move on to talk about some of the confinement feeding systems that you might see in action. So this is a self-feeder system, and this is probably the most common type of confinement feeding system that I see implemented on farms. This is a sheep enterprise. It's a fairly large-ish sheep enterprise. They run about 10,000 breeders, and this is just an aerial view. The shed in the background is the wool shed, and there's a group of people actually standing in a central laneway, coming closer to the front of the picture. And on either side, you can see 100 by 100 metre pens. You can see the sheep in the pens. The yellow sort of circles are hay bales. The self-feeders, which are the silver things lined up along the fence, and there's some shade trees. The little white spots are lime and salt containers. And I just wanted to show you over sort of towards the middle, but on the right, you can see that's their entire feeding setup. There's a bit of a haystack there. There's a couple of silos and a bit of equipment, but you can run one of these sorts of self-feeder systems with fairly low inputs. You don't need a lot of gear. And this farm actually, during the long drought, locked their breeders up in laneways and fed breeders in laneways, and then they locked young stock and weaners for sort of more high growth rates up into these 100 by 100 containment feeding pens. This is just the same system standing in that central laneway looking along it. So you can see the self feeders, they're designed so that you can feed over the fence. You don't have to drive into the pens. And these sorts of, and sorry, on the right, you can see hays fed separate to the grain, and there's some induction troughing over the back where the animals are inducted, or we can maintain breeders. But these systems are pretty popular because they're low cost and they're versatile. So when the time for the confinement feeding is finished and the drought ends, the self feeders and the hay racks can be packed away in the shed, or they can be moved out to breeders in paddocks or something like that, leaving very little infrastructure to deteriorate in the weather. And it also reduces your labour inputs. So once the animals are inducted and they're on the self feeders, you can fill the feeders up once or twice a week, and it reduces your labour inputs. Now, it's not a get out of jail card free. You actually need to be there every day to check the stock and, you know, check the waters and clean the water troughs and those sorts of things, make sure the stock are healthy. But when droughts are long and they go on for a long time, it does help if you can get away just for a day or two off the farm occasionally. And this sort of system allows for that to happen. And it's just easy to feed because you don't have to drive into the pens. You can fill the self feeders up over the fence. We also found these systems useful for cattle. So similarly here on the left is some calves that have been early weaned, and it doesn't have to be too flash. It can just be in yards. This is just a hay rack that's separate. And then these guys have been inducted in some troughing and then moved on to some self feeders. So it can work for cattle as well. The downside of these sorts of self feeder systems is it can be difficult to regulate who eats what. So breeder animals that you only want to restrict to a maintenance ration, even if you close the feeder down as best you can, bored animals that are locked up 24 hours a day with not much to do will overeat and lick and lick and lick and eat more than their share. So it can be difficult to regulate just maintenance rations out of a self feeder. And you do get variations. So you'll get some animals who overeat and eat a fair bit, and you can get some acidosis, and you can get animals who undereat and you can get a tail on the mob. We can regulate that with things like space and accessibility to the feeders, but it still is a bit of an issue with these systems. And it's just important to note that induction still needs to be done with troughing for the first 10 to 14 days on a self-feeder system. The second sort of system that we see, particularly for these low-cost drought feeding setups, is just running a grain trail in confinement pens as opposed to in the paddock. And these can be done really simply. So on the left, you can see that's a pretty good setup. They're a nice little mob of even lambs. And that's just some C-section screwed onto drench drums with the grain in it. Similarly, in the middle, that's just some grain-fed lambs on conveyor belt. And on the right, just some calves in some troughing. But the point of these is it's good to be able to get the grain up off the ground. In the paddock, you'll get away with feeding on the ground, but in confinement where there's a lot of fecal contamination, we really don't want them eating where they're defecating just because of the disease risk. It's good with these sorts of grain systems if you can design them so you don't have to drive into the pen, but sometimes it's just unavoidable because of the setup. So you do have to sort of navigate the animals, and they get pretty good on the gates once they know where the feed's coming from. These are good systems because you can really accurately measure out how much is going out. So you can control intake. So it's really good for breeding setups like breeder cows or breeder ewes. You can really accurately control how much they're getting. And you can manage the bullies and the shy feeders because everybody gets an equal opportunity to come to the trail. The downside is that they do need to be fed every day. So it's a daily labour input to go and feed them every day. In recent years, there's been fairly significant technological advancements that have seen automated feeding setups come onto the market, particularly for sheep. So this is a Boyd system. And this is on the left, you can see the silos. So some of those silos will have different commodities in them. So maybe lupins and barley and maybe buffer pellet. And it can be programmed electronically to mix the ration at the correct amounts, and then it will come down and fill the central self-feeder line. So significantly more cost, but you know, you get some labor saving advantages from that. And this is just a different type of automated feeding setup. This is a FeedTech system where the mixed grain is in the silo that you can see down the end, and it's delivered down this automated feed trough in programmed amounts at set intervals, or when the sensor at the end is uncovered. So once the animals have eaten the grain, more comes out. And these systems are great. They are a big investment, especially if the confinement feeding that you're going to do is sporadic and you're only going to do it during drought. So you need to, and it doesn't get you out of all of the labour. So you do still need to be there to check the stock, manage the ill health, check for any animals that are sick, clean the water troughs, and do all those sorts of things. So you can't, it's not just set and forget and walk away. So there's some really great innovations occurring in this space. But my advice would be do your research, and there's heaps of them, there's heaps of producers with these on farms right across Australia. So there's plenty of opportunity to look at them and to do some research and work out if they're the right thing for you. Now, mixed rations are another feeding system, and these are really commonly used for cattle and becoming more popular, at least in my area, for sheep. So I'm really pleased that post drought, my clients all decided they were going to put, a lot of them decided they were going to put silage away, which was just a really great thing. They didn't expect to have to crack open the silage pits quite so early, but here we are. We're into our silage and we're making total mixed rations. So typically this involves having a feed mixer, which can mix various commodities like grains, silage, hays, and other sorts of byproducts and concentrates. So the important things to note with these systems is you need enough bunk space for each animal to eat its daily ration, and that bunk needs to hold the daily ration. So it's a really fiber-based ration, it needs to hold that bulk. And it's tricky, it's less, I suppose it's less tricky with cattle, but more tricky with sheep. You need the animals not to climb into the bunks and defecate, because if they soil the feed, they won't want to eat it and they'll leave. You'll get a lot of feed wastage that you've got to go and then shovel out of the bunk. So these systems are really good. We get really good growth rates out of these systems because we can make a really good complete ration that the animals don't sort, and you don't tend to get the acidosis risks. We can control bugs really happy, so we get really good results. And we can create lower cost drought rations by combining, say, poorer quality ingredients or low cost ingredients like silage with higher quality ingredients to reduce the cost. So the downside of these systems is the bunks, the cost of the mixer, the cost of the commodities and the storage of those commodities, and just the fact that you do have to be there every day or even twice a day to feed the animals. There's just a video there of feeding out a ration. I hope that's come through for everybody's internet tonight. So there's a fair bit to consider before you establish a confinement feeding area. So where you're going to put it to start with, so slope and drainage and the soil type and things like that's really important. And I've put legislation here last on the list, but it really should go first on the list. So before building anything, you need to check your local council and state requirements. In New South Wales, the state environmental planning policy, so the primary production and rural development, confinement feeding areas used on a temporary basis for drought, fire, flood, or routine husbandry procedures don't require approval. But if the area was to be used to feed lot animals on a commercial basis for production outcomes, approval is required. In Queensland, sheep feedlots with more than 1,000 head require approval, and cattle with more than 150 head in a yard or enclosure where they're being fed entirely by hand and can't graze require approval. Drought-fed stock in a drought-declared area where animals are fed no more than their nutritional requirements, supplementary feeding in the paddock, or keeping animals confined and fed temporarily are not considered feedlots and don't require approval. So you need to check and you need to put some thought into that. The other things to consider is in terms of the site selection is how public it is, distance to roads, dwellings and waterways, and your impact on other people and the environment. Wet weather access and access to things like yards and feed storage sites, and wet weather access. And then when you're building it, in terms, you need to think about whether it's going to be for, say, maintenance of breeders or fattening weaners, or the species that you're dealing with, and things like stocking density, mob size, feed trough space, water trough space, and water quality and shade are going to come into it. So those are all things to think about. And local land services have put out a really great confinement feeding handbook, which goes through a lot of these things. And even if you're not in New South Wales, that's a really useful resource that's just compiled a lot of the information and a lot of the specifications and put them all in one spot. So I would highly recommend that. I'm going to reference that from here onwards. So look, we talked about all of the benefits of confinement feeding, and as you can tell, I am a big fan. Only not because we need to do it all the time, but just because it gives us an option to manage stocking rate in what is becoming an increasingly variable environment. However, there are some challenges. Firstly, the cost of establishing it and feeding. So often these things aren't necessarily built in the drought. We plan ahead and we sort of, might do a bit and revise it and go again, and slowly it comes together. But some significant planning does need to go into it to get it right. The other challenges are the quantity of feed required and the distance that we've got to cart that feed depending on where you're located. If we don't quite get it right, there will be disease risks. If they're well managed, we really do minimise the animal health risks and the issues. But yeah, disease risks are a concern for people, especially who haven't done it before. The environmental impacts, so the compacted ground, the dust, the noise and the smell. The labour requirement and the responsibility of having stock locked up. And just the it feels quite daunting, especially if you decide to do this mid-drought and you haven't done it before. So do plan ahead. In the current financial climate, the primary question probably is not should I containment feed. The question really should be, should I feed? Because we've got high commodity prices and low stock prices. And if you've done your sums, which I highly recommend you do, and you've decided that you are going to feed, then I think the answer, should I confinement feed, becomes much easier. That's the easy bit. So there's a number of really great online tools to help you do some figures. So this is the New South Wales Drought Feeding Calculator. Now there's two versions of this. This white one with the white background is the older version, and it assumes that the animals are being confinement fed, so there's no paddock feed involved. The newer one, which has got the blue background, it takes into account paddock feed, and it's got a few more sort of layers of complexity to it, so it does a bit more. But have a play with both of them. It'll help you make the ration, and that's what you can see on the left-hand side there. So we've got some commodities. You can override it and put your own feed tests in, or you can use the generic ones, but we've made a bit of a ration there. You calculate the energy and the protein of that ration. It'll tell us how much it costs on a cents per megajoule basis, and also what we're paying for protein, and it'll tell us the tonnage price. And then on the right, we can feed a group of animals for a set period of days, and it will tell us how much they need per head per day, what it's going to cost per day, and how many commodities, like how many tons of commodities we're going to need for that period. So it's a really great tool. It's probably got some limitations in that we can only combine 3 feeds. It is a drought feeding calculator, so it will only allow you to put, say, 500 grams a day on a calf or a young bovine, but it's a really good starting spot for doing your drought rations. To further these sorts of calculators and the tools that are available, this is the Sheep CRC Sheep and Lamb Feedlot Calculator that was developed by Jeff Duddy and others several years ago. It's awesome because you can put in not only the ration cost, but you can start to put in things like the store value of the animal, the skin value, the other associated costs with feeding that animal, labour, like feed out costs, cartage, shearing, vaccinations, commission, all interest, if you've financed the animals, all those sorts of things. You can put all of that in. And I've been doing this quite a bit lately. This is just an example of taking a 20 kilo store weaner right through to being a 55 kilo heavy animal. And we've said that he's a $20 store animal. He's a crossbred lamb. He's got no skin value. He's eating a ration that's worth $384 a tonne. And we've calculated that he'll eat 1.4 kilos a day across that entire feeding period. He's going to gain 220 grams of weight. We've included all those costs, which you can see summarized down the bottom there on the left. And basically, once we've done all that, we need to feed him for 159 days to get him to that weight. We can put in the end slaughter price and the yield. So we've put in there that he's worth $4.50 and the yield of 47%. And after all of that, we're projected to lose $20 a head. So look, there's many variables in that, and that's just a rough example of some of the figures that are popping up at the moment. And it's just to show you the example of the power of data to make decisions when you're deciding to feed animals. And here's a similar example for cattle. So here's a 300 kilo animal with a store value of $500 and a ration that's $416 a tonne. If that animal eats 11 kilos a day for a 6 feeding period, he's going to eat $308 worth of feed. There's other associated costs of $97, $30 of labour, and if they gain 1.9 kilos of weight, we can work out that what he'll weigh at the end of the feeding period and a sale price at the other end. So he's worth $960 for an overall profit of $25 a head. Now, each business is going to make a different decision on whether or not that's good enough. So some might say, yep, that's great, that's cash flow, and the market might go ahead in that period. Others might think, no, that's too much risk for too little money. The market might drop. And others might say, we can't feed everything here. We need to prioritize our breeders and let these weaners go. We just can't physically feed everything. So this sort of data helps drive those sorts of decisions, and it helps clear the path for what you're going to do on your farm. And everybody probably in a situation like that will make maybe a slightly different decision. If we're moving into confinement feeding, there's a few livestock management tips that need to occur before we move animals in. It needs to be planned. It can't be done on the spur of the moment. They need to be vaccinated for clostridial diseases. We're most commonly going to be feeding these animals a starch diet or a cereal grain-based diet in a lot of cases. So we need to vaccinate them before they go in. Hopefully they've been imprinted. So imprinting means feeding on their mother, and they really only need 3 small feeds, and their mother teaches them to put grain or foreign grains, and it doesn't really matter which grain. They're quite universal in terms of if you feed barley, they'll eat lupins or vice versa. So imprinting is really, really important. And even once they're imprinted, you'll still get potentially 5% of animals that are shy feeders in confinement and need to be managed out into a shy feeder pen. But if they're not imprinted, you'll get an awful lot more than that. So if you're going to be buying store animals to feed, if you've made that decision, and especially as the market changes and that becomes maybe something people are thinking about doing, buying animals that are imprinting is vitally important to having a successful experience. Once they're in, we want to draft them on body weight, and we want to move those shy feeders out. And we want to redraft them every, say, month. So some will go ahead, some will fall behind, and we'll need to redraft them back into their body weights. The first 14 days is the induction period. It's really important. And often I see ill health or problems later on in the feeding period, but a lot of that stems back to poor induction. So we need to get the induction right. They need really clean water. And I spend a lot of time looking at poo. So their feces can tell you a lot about how their rumen's going. And if there's scours and things like that, you might have some acidosis occurring. So this picture here is probably of what we don't want our confinement feeding to look like. We've got a higgledy-piggledy bunch of animals that are all different body weights. There's not enough trough space and there's an awful lot of competition. You can see the bullies that are pushing their way in, and you can see the shy ones that have popped out the back and can't get a feed. And over on the right next to the ram, you can see a little shy feeder with his head down and a pot belly that looks a bit hollow. He, probably needs to come out and go in a shy feeder pen. So that's what we don't want. I've included some space recommendations in here for completion, and so that you can refer back to them later, but I really would refer you to the LLS manual, A Guide to Confinement Feeding Sheep and Cattle in New South Wales, which is available online. It's a really great document. And you'll find all of these in there. One point that I'd like to make, though, is that your pen sizes and density and mob sizes and feed trough space all need to align. So see on the right-hand side here, see, for example, we've got a 50 by 30 metre pen, and that says that space will fit, let's say, for example, 300 lambs. But if we are going to feed these guys in a trough for induction, or either in a bunk, longer term, or we're going to feed some, maintain some breeding ewes in there, they need 30 centimetres per head on single-sided trough spacing. So if we were to feed those 300 head that can fit in that pen on a density basis, we would actually need 90 metres of single-sided trough space. So here we've got a pen that's 30 metres across and 50 metres tall. So on the 30 metre side, we can potentially feed 100 ewes, and on the 50 metre side, we can feed 166 ewes. But we don't have enough trough space to feed the whole 300 on induction. So you just need to bear that in mind. That we can get around that. We can put other induction troughing elsewhere in the pen and go in there and trough it out to them. But you just need to bear that in mind, that the animals that you've got in there have all got somewhere to come and eat. There's lots of different ways to set your pens up, and these are all featured in that LLS document as well. You can have your troughing and your feed out trough in a separate pen so that you don't have to drive in, and you can let this is in the top left-hand corner, you can let each pen of sheep out into the troughing area to eat. It's time consuming, but it does save you driving in with the sheep or with the stock. That would work for calves as well. And on the right, you can see here with the self-feeder setups, which are really common for early weaning calves and lambs. We just want the feeders right away from the water, because we want whatever they've eaten out of the feeders, we want it to be gone out of the mouth by the time they come to the water trough, because the spilt grain is going to drop into the water trough and sour the water. And animals in confinement, if they don't drink, their daily feed intake will drop, and then their production will drop. And if they start to lose weight, they will get sick. So we just need to manage cleanliness of the water. And we just need to make sure there's enough trough space for everybody in terms of feed trough. This is the space allocations for feed trough, and it's spelled out in that manual, not only for, say, induction and bunk spacing, but also for self-feeder allocations. Okay, so 3 to 5 centimetres of self-feeder space for sheep and 7 to 10 centimetres of self-feeder space for cattle. And we really found this last drought was where there is not enough trough space in terms of self-feeders, so where there's too much competition at the self-feeder, you will get acidosis cases, which sounds crazy, because you would think when you've got acidosis, your reaction to that would be to close down the feeders and allow less access to the grain. But in reality, what we actually had to do was increase the access to the grain, because there seems to be some sheep and cow psychology that makes animals think that if there's too much competition and they've got to fight for the feed, they will overeat. Whereas if they've got enough space, they seem to chill out and not suffer from the acidosis events. So that was something really interesting we found just practically. And so it's well worth just considering how many feeders you've got if you're going to go for a self-feeder system. Livestock nutrition. Now we held AHN held a 2-day drought lotting tour up here, and we spent 2 days on all of this. So it's very hard to jam all this into a 40-minute webinar. We could talk for hours on livestock nutrition, but you've got to get your diet right. So do your own calculations, but also you probably need some professional advice to get it right, especially with the price of things and the availability of commodities at the moment. People are starting to lean towards byproducts and like, I suppose, less attractive commodities just because things are expensive and they're difficult to get, which means we've really got to pay attention to what we're doing so that we don't end up with problems. For good results and few disease issues, we really need to ensure that the animals get adequate energy. Energy is always the driver of this and the most important, followed by protein, then roughage, then minerals and vitamins. And the actual ingredients and the proportions in the diet are going to depend on the size of the animals, the age, the physiological state, and what you're trying to achieve. So it's probably a bit beyond the scope of tonight to go into that in depth. But broadly speaking, we really just want to say, is there enough megajoules in the diet? So is there enough energy? Is the protein adequate? Is there enough fiber for comfort and rumen health and like acidosis prevention and lactation? Are the minerals right? Because we know that most drought diets are deficient in sodium and calcium, and we need to get the calcium to phosphorus ratio right to avoid things like water belly and hypocalcemia. And we want to just make sure there are enough vitamins. So particularly drought affected animals are deficient in vitamin A and E, and they get that from green feed. So once the green feed runs out, they will start to deplete their liver stores of vitamin A and E, and eventually they'll run out and become clinically deficient. So last drought, we sort of we made the mistake of not correcting that early enough. This time, because we just don't know how long the dry period is going to go on for, we are certainly putting vitamins in the diet from the very get-go so that we don't end up deficient. I'd also recommend feed testing your commodities and your rations and just really getting some professional advice to make sure that you've got your mix right. I think I've mentioned this already, but induction, so the first 14 days of introducing the animals to the confinement pens and getting them onto the diet is really critical to success. So they need to be imprinted, they need to come in, they need to be drafted up into similar body weights and classes of animal, and everybody needs to come in and eat. That's their job for the first 14 days. And we identify the shy feeders and we put them back out maybe into a paddock or onto a really good bale of hay. And we slowly step the grain ration or the total mix ration up over the 14 days. And it doesn't really matter how often you feed them, once, twice, or 3 times a day. If you feed them more regularly, you can step them up a bit quicker. And if there's anything that upsets the routine, like a change in the weather, feed left on the ground, upset to the routine, just go back a step and start again. And during this period, they do need good quality roughage, which is challenging, lime and salt, or mineral additives, and potentially buffers. And just a note on the buffers, there's lots of different buffers. Some of them are ionophores, and some ionophores need to be declared on NVDs when you're eventually selling animals to slaughter. So just bear that in mind and get some advice on that. Now, if we do everything right, we're going to really minimise our animal health issues. But probably the big 5 issues that we do see in confinement are acidosis primarily. That's the big one. Shy feeders, and often acidosis and shy feeders occur together. So you'll get some animals who overeat and some animals who undereat. We see mineral deficiencies like hypocalcemia. We see water belly, which is urinary stones, and we see vitamin A deficiency. And I've put down the bottom there that we've got, other things like pulpy kidney, pneumonia, pink eye, scours, prolapses, and softening of the brain or thiamine deficiency as well. I've put the barometer there because I watch the barometric pressure. Animals will go off their feed when the barometric pressure drops, and then they'll go back on their feed when the barometric pressure returns to normal, and that can play havoc when you've got animals in confinement on a ration. And I spend a lot of time looking at poo. But do develop a relationship with your livestock and don't ignore the odd sick or dead animal. They can be the tip of the iceberg. And if you can investigate them, you can often offset the bigger disasters down the track. I just want to finish up with some points on maintaining breeders. So at least for us here, in Northwest New South Wales, which is still Southern Australia, we're at the point where most of us have weaned young stock, and we're now back to just core breeders. The weaners are being either sold or managed separately, and we're back to those core breeders. These might be the guys or the girls that you're bringing into confinement and that you're maintaining over summer. Maintenance feeding of breeders is a long game. You don't know when it will end. It is really great to group them all together, and then therefore you can feed them in a few hours rather than opening gates and traversing paddocks and doing a million different loads to pick up more grain or more ration. But it's a big job. Once we've got breeders, it becomes really an art of doing your sums and restricting access to too much feed. We need to manage that condition score so that they don't get over fat and they don't get unfit laying around a self feeder. So it really becomes a job of controlling condition score and controlling the dollars. So it's a long game. We need the vitamins and minerals to be right in those rations so that they don't eventually run out of things like vitamin A and E. We can join really well in confinement. So this works really well for sheep. With cattle, they need a bit more space just so that nobody gets hurt, but joining in confinement can be really successful. But we don't recommend lambing or calving in confinement. I hope one day we can crack the code and we can actually get that right. But at the moment, there's too many risks of mismothering. But also just, it's a fairly contaminated environment, and you've got things like little animals hitting the ground that pick up infections in the days following birth, but also with open teat canals, you can get mastitis and things like that as well. So lambing and calving in confinement is really not recommended. So it's good to prioritise maintaining your breeders now, spelling your paddocks so that they can go out and lamb or calve in the paddocks later on. And I just want to end on saying that your mental health and lifestyle is really important. Feeding livestock is a big commitment. It's a big financial commitment. It's a big daily grind, and just keep setting decision points and making evidence-based decisions, and just keep reaching out for assistance and to talk to the people around you, whether that's your neighbours, other producers or professionals in the industry. Just surround yourself with good people and just keep making those evidence-based decisions. In conclusion, I think that containment feeding or confinement feeding really does have a place on every farm. With good planning, a smart setup and attention to detail, they can be a really versatile option for managing livestock throughout adverse seasonal conditions. However, in the current economic climate, the decision to feed is a tricky one, and you need to do your sums, prioritise, keep setting decision points and making evidence-based decisions. And there's a list of tools and resources there that you can avail yourself of. And I'm sure that Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista will make them available beyond the webinar as well. So that's me. Thank you for having me. And I'll hand back over to Tanisha.
Thank you, Jill. That was a really good overview of confinement feeding or containment feeding and how it might be used. I think it was really good that you kept highlighting the need for data when making these decisions. So we've got a few questions that have come through now already, but if you have any questions for Jill, just head to slido.com and enter the code NOV2023, and that's how we're managing the questions for tonight's webinar. The first question that I've got come through here, Jill, is how often did you say we need to clean the water trough and why is this?
I think you need to clean the water troughs daily, which I know nobody wants to hear, but I think that's really important. And it's not so much about the algae buildup. It's not really the algae that we're worried about. It's actually spilt cereal grains, which taint the water and they don't want to drink. It tastes sour to a ruminant. And they also don't like dust film on the water either. So that if you notice, they'll always come and drink at the fresh end of the trough where the water dribbles in, because they like a broken surface. So yeah, they don't like the dust film either. So fresh water is gold. And a lot of the troughing now in confinement has gone to really low volume troughs. That's fine, because it means that it's easy to clean, and when you clean it out daily, it doesn't leave a massive puddle in the pen. But you just need to watch the temperature of that water. So the temperature needs to be cool. If it's too warm, they won't drink, and when they don't drink, they don't eat, and when they don't eat, they get sick. So bear that in mind.
Thanks, Jill. That's a really good point, particularly about the temperature. The next question that I've got here is, why do you need to consider fibre for lactation?
In the rumen is a magical place, and in the rumen, by doing cool things with what we put in, we can skew the volatile fatty acid profile. And for lactation, we want lots of the volatile fatty acid acetate, and we get that by feeding fibre. So that's why dairy cow rations are really different to feedlot rations. Dairy cow rations are very much more fibre based because it promotes lactation.
There you go. Very interesting. The rumen's an amazing thing, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we don't want those lactating girls to live solely on roughage, but I'm just talking maybe, 10 or 20% of their diet needs to be roughage.
Excellent. Thanks, Jill. The next question I've got here is, what are the key indicators that you notice that tell you if there's not enough feed or competition as the cause of acidosis instead of something else?
Just say that again. If there's not enough feed, did you say?
Yeah. So how do you
Yeah,
know
too
if
much.
it's not enough feed or too much competition, not something else?
Yeah, so I'd have a look at the guidelines, and I'd have a look at what you've got and make sure you've got enough, measure how much space you've got. But what we've seen is, it just seems to be big fat animals who die sporadically. You'll go out, and there'll just be one dead one, and he's a big fat one. Yeah, and you can't find anything else that's done it, and if I've got people on like a fairly high grain ration, I'll often give them a set of rumen pH test strips to have. The rumen pH can tell you if they've died of acidosis, and it's a pretty simple test that producers can do on farm themselves. So getting some rumen pH test strips, and if you do see a dead one, you can just do a pH and see what his rumen pH is. Less than 5.5 is acidosis. That can be kind of handy too. But typically the presentation is just sporadic big fat lamb deaths, and everybody's pretty sad about that. Or yeah, not just lambs, calves as well, but everyone's pretty sad about that.
Definitely. The next one that's come through, Jill, is, how critical is shade for sheep?
Yeah, so there's been research has done internationally and also in Southern Australia that suggests that sheep don't need shade in confinement, but I would disagree with that. Sheep, especially, live and work in a fairly hot part of the world, and when it's 43 degrees here in summer, they look uncomfortable. They really need shade for welfare as well as for production. And we've found that without shade, they stand near each other. They try and put their heads under each other's armpits, and they pant to try to reduce their body heat, and they don't eat. So yeah, I am a strong advocate for shade in confinement feeding setups. And that shade is tricky because I mean, existing trees tend to get ring barked, or they don't like the manure and the urine, and they don't survive long term. Other structures that we rig up with shade cloth and things like that tend to flap apart in the wind or get eaten by cockatoos and things like that. So shade can be tricky to maintain. It really needs to breathe, like something that the air can pass through is much better than a fixed solid structure. But yeah, it can be tricky to get that shade in there. We've done all sorts of things in droughts, like moving machinery into pens on really hot days, and cutting up old poly tanks to make shade structures and all sorts of things. So yeah, it's but it doesn't matter what you need to do. It needs to be a priority, especially if you're setting up one of these setups from scratch.
Thanks, Jill. And is there anything on trade covered in the LLS manual?
Yeah, there is.
The next question I've got come through is what precautions should be taken when changing over feed? So, for example, from fava beans to barley.
Yeah, good. I mean, barley and fava beans are fairly different. One's more of a pulse, one's more of a cereal, so they're going to have different qualities. You'd want to put that into your ration calculator and make sure it's the right thing. But broadly speaking, even if we were going to shandy, say between batches of barley or between batches of pellets, or we would shandy it. So we wouldn't just go cold turkey one to the other. We would shandy any changes to any rations. Just because even if you are shandying, say, from one batch of barley to another, they might look the same, but the inherent properties of that barley in terms of the starch content and things like that might vary quite dramatically. And so those sorts of changeovers can cause animals to either not eat for a couple of days until they're hungry enough that they have to eat, and then they get acidosis, or it can be that the inherent nature of the feed in terms of, say, the starch content or the protein content can be damaging to them. So always shandy everything. Don't cold turkey anything.
Thanks, Jill. That leads really well into the next question, which was how do I know how much to feed during induction? So you said 10 to 14 days, but how much do I feed on each of those days?
Yeah, so again, I don't know what you're feeding, if you're feeding sheep or cattle, but New South Wales DPI have a booklet called the Managing and Preparing for Drought Handbook, and it goes through in depth how to induct animals. So what to start them off at, how to step it up, when to step it up, all those sorts of things. But broadly speaking, you start on a fairly low amount. Again, it's hard for me to say an exact amount when I don't know what we're feeding, but generally we sort of step it up about 10% every couple of days until we get up to almost where we're aiming to get them. And yeah, just go to that reference to find out more.
And what about when I'm letting my stock out of the containment area?
Oh, good point. So let's say we've all had general rain and we're all back to a really great season. I wouldn't let them out on the first rain. So any grass that grows, short green pick is going to be really high moisture and they're going to have to chase that to get their nutrient requirements. So I would wait for the second fall of rain or wait for the feed to grow. So typically that might be 3 weeks, after you think the drought's broken. So allow that to occur. And then it's really interesting. Animals typically eat more in the mornings. They typically eat a fair bit in the mornings and they have a camp at lunchtime and then they go out and have a smaller volume graze after lunch. So if we're ever going to let animals out, even if you just say putting them into a crop paddock or something like that, we tend to do it after lunch. So it's always a good idea if you're going to let animals out, do it after lunch once they're full and make sure they've got a full belly of, say, hay, or make sure they're full. Don't let them out on an empty stomach. And if the feed is, green following rain, we'd want to have them vaccinated for pulpy kidney, and yeah, it's gonna be a bit of a change of diet. So we would just want to monitor their health during that changeover period as well.
And if still it's not best case scenario, it's worst case, and we're letting them out for lamb or calves down, are there any extra considerations there?
Yeah, so we don't really want to handle animals within about 4 weeks of lambing or calving. So we want to get them. It becomes a bit tricky. We don't want to let them out too close. We don't want to handle them too close. So you sort of want to get them in those paddocks, 2 to 4 weeks, maybe 4 weeks before they're going to lamb or calve, and we want to get them. If there's no feed in the paddock, if the feed's not enough to satisfy their requirements, they're going to be fed in the paddock anyway. So we just want to get them in that routine 4 weeks pre-lambing or calving, and get them used to the feed coming and the feed delivery, and it just reduces the amount of hassles and mismothering that occurs, and it just gives the cow or the lamb the safety and the security to go off and lamb or calve in privacy and come back and know that the feed's going to be there. So yeah, I think yeah, just getting prepared and doing it well in advance of that lambing or calving date's the advice.
Thanks, Jill. The next question, I'll combine a couple of questions. So there was a question around, can't sudden death of good-looking sheep also be pulpy kidney? And we also have another question of, what should I do if I find a dead one in the containment area?
Yeah, so it absolutely could be pulpy kidney. Hopefully they're going to be vaccinated, because we vaccinated them before we started feeding the grain, and the pulpy kidney vaccine is it provides pretty good coverage. But yeah, if I had a dead lamb, I'd ring my vet and I'd get them to come out and do a post-mortem and start to investigate what's gone on, because if it is pulpy kidney, we need to vaccinate to stop that. If it's grain poisoning, we need to do something to stop that too. And those things we're going to instigate to stop it are going to be different. So I would get a diagnosis.
Great, thank you, Jill. I've got one final question here for this evening. There'll be enough time for one more if anyone has any last questions, but otherwise, when we're getting feed tests, what are the key components we're looking for, and what are the red flags we want to avoid if we see them in the test?
Yeah, so most feed testing labs will just offer a general test for a set price, and that will be pretty comprehensive. Things that you want to look for are moisture, particularly, like, not so much in grains, but in like silage particularly, because you're gonna have to adjust the amount fed if it's full of moisture, and that will be true for things like byproducts. So yeah, moisture content, energy, because energy is king, and we always focus our rations around energy. Crude protein, the oil content. We don't want oil to exceed about 6%. And the digestibility of the feed or the fiber content. There might be a few other, depending on what, there might be ash, something like that, which just suggests dirt contamination. It just depends really what you're feeding, and they can be pretty complicated. So again, that's probably another reason to reach out and ask for some advice if you're not quite sure, if you don't know how to interpret the results. Just yeah, there's lots of professionals in that space that can help you.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Jill. We've had one last question sneak in before the bell. What are the ways to supplement vitamin A other than the ADE injection?
Yeah, so vitamin A and E are probably best supplemented via the diet. So you can buy feedlot concentrates or mineral concentrates that go into the ration at a percentage, so maybe 4% of the ration or something like that. And good quality oral vitamin A, I think, delivered daily into the ration is probably better than the injectables. But that's not possible for everybody. So yeah, vitamin A, D, and E injections are the alternative. And my advice with them is don't let the full 6 months go by where their livers completely run out of those vitamins before you start to give those injections. Start in advance and be really careful how you give them, because they are an oily injection and they will make animals lame if they're not given really carefully into the muscle. So yeah, they're your options with vitamin A.
Thank you, Jill. We've certainly covered quite a lot of ground tonight. So lucky that the webinar tonight has been recorded. So if anyone's joined late or would like to watch the webinar again, don't forget to head to the MLA or Agrista website to watch that recording. I'd like to say a massive thank you to you, Jill, for sharing your insight and expertise about containment feeding. It's definitely something that's been spoken about quite a lot at the moment. So it's good to have the guidance to help people get it right. For those who have attended this evening, if you have any additional questions or suggestions for future webinar topics, please reach out by completing the survey on the QR code on your screen. This really helps us to guide the topics for future webinars and make sure that we're hitting the mark by bringing you topics that you wish to hear about. If you're watching this recording, you can also scan the QR code and complete the survey. We will value your feedback as well. I'd like to say a massive thank you again for attending, and we look forward to you all joining us again for our next webinar on the 13th of December. Next month, we will be hearing from John Francis about assessing and managing business risk, which is particularly important in the current environment. And don't forget, if you missed last month's webinar, head to the MLA or Agrista website to watch it. And if you're super keen to hear more, be sure to check out our podcast series. You can see this on all major podcast platforms, and it's called the Productivity and Profitability Media Series. Thank you very much, Phil, and thanks everyone for attending.